I spent my childhood in a remote forested area of Oregon, tucked away on a quiet cul-de-sac more than 10 miles from the nearest town. Our little corner of the world consisted of just 7 homes, each one nestled on wooded properties of at least 2.5 acres. Looking back, one of the strangest things about where we lived was how isolated it truly was. The region had no dangerous wildlife to speak of. There were no bears or any other large predators in that part of the state, and strangers simply never wandered through our area. In fact, during the entire 2 decades I lived there, I never once encountered a lost traveler or any unexpected animal roaming around. I'm telling you this up front because it's important for understanding just how unsettling what happened to me really was. When I was around 14 years old, I had this good friend named Marcus who lived in the house next to ours. He was a few years older than me, which meant his parents let him stay out much later than mine did. Sometimes after he got home late from hanging out with his friends, he would wander over to my yard and toss little pebbles from the gravel area up at my second-floor bedroom window because he wanted to chat. My bed was positioned right next to that window, so I'd hear the tapping, open it up, and we'd whisper back and forth for a while, sharing stories about our day. The window had a perfect view of our backyard, and I could see his house off to one side, just beyond some shrubbery and the worn footpath that connected to his driveway. It was easy for me to tell whether he was still out or already home for the night. If the light above his side entrance was on, he wasn't back yet, but if it was dark, he'd made it home. One particular autumn evening stands out in my memory with perfect clarity. It was around midnight, and I had my window cracked open just enough to let in the crisp fall air that I loved so much. I heard a car pull into his driveway and recognized the sound of Marcus talking with his friends before their vehicle drove away. Without really thinking it through, I called out to him as softly as I could manage, hoping he would hear me without waking my parents because I wanted to chat for a bit. But he must not have heard me because he just kept walking toward his house without responding. That's when this admittedly foolish idea popped into my head. I'd sneak outside and scare him, just like we've done to each other countless times over the years during our woodland adventures. After spending so many years exploring those woods together, I'd gotten pretty good at moving through them without making a sound. Moving as quietly as I possibly could, I crept down the stairs and slipped out through our back garage door, which opened directly into the backyard below my bedroom window. From there, I knew the route by heart, a well-worn path that stretched about 25 feet through the trees to Marcus's property, cutting through a gravel area my parents had installed near the back of our house. They had put in that gravel section mainly because the massive pine trees cast so much shade that hardly anything could grow there anyway. What made crossing it tricky was that my parents had placed these 14-inch pine log rounds as stepping stones across the gravel, and if you accidentally stepped off one of those rounds, the crunching sound of the gravel would give you away immediately. I picked my way across those log rounds with the kind of practiced silence that only comes from years of sneaking around, letting my eyes slowly adjust to the darkness as I faced toward Marcus's house. The smell of decaying leaves hung heavy in the cool night air, and everything felt perfectly normal at first. But when I looked around, I couldn't spot Marcus anywhere, which struck me as odd. Then I heard the sound of his door closing, followed by his exterior light switching off, which immediately told me he'd already gone inside and was probably heading to bed. I stood there for a moment, about to give up and head back inside myself, when I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the wooded area between our 2 properties. The strange thing was, whatever I had seen wasn't moving along our usual path. This immediately seemed weird to me, because anyone who knew the area would stick to the path. Veering off meant pushing through wild blackberry bushes that had these vicious thorns, something we'd only do if we absolutely had to. For a second, I wondered if maybe Marcus had spotted me sneaking out and decided to flip the script on my little ambush plan by coming at me from an unexpected angle. I could just barely make out what looked like a human-sized dark shape moving slowly through the undergrowth, and it would pause every so often, almost like it was listening or watching for something. The shape kept getting closer, and even though I could definitely see it, something about the whole situation felt off. It wasn't heading straight toward my window where we'd normally meet up to talk. I crouched down low and waited in complete silence, still half convinced that this was just Marcus trying to outscare me. I kept watching this shadowy figure that looked human-shaped as it continued moving through the woods, though the thick foliage would block my view of it every few seconds. Whatever it was seemed to be moving with real purpose, stalking carefully and deliberately, stopping every few feet to pause and listen while staying hidden behind the trees and bushes. After watching this for what felt like forever, my patience finally wore thin, so I whispered Marcus's name one last time into the darkness. When I got no response at all, I started feeling less excited about my prank and more uneasy about the whole situation. Getting tired of crouching there in the shadows, I decided to quietly tiptoe back to my garage entrance and slip back inside, making sure to carefully lock everything behind me as I went. I made my way back upstairs to my bedroom as silently as I had left, my heart beating a little faster now. My room sat directly above the spot where I'd just been hiding outside, and I had left my window open. Almost immediately, I could clearly hear something or someone moving around in the yard below. I leaned toward the window and whispered Marcus's name again, but just like before, I got absolutely no response. Then, without any warning, I heard what sounded like someone or something taking a tumble, followed by this grunt or moan that rang out pretty loudly from the window well positioned directly beneath my bedroom. It wasn't quite loud enough to wake my parents, but it was unmistakably clear, and the sound sent this ice-cold wave of terror shooting through my entire body. If you've never seen a window well before, let me explain what they are. They're these semicircular holes that get dug out beside a house's foundation, usually about 3 or 4 feet deep, and they're reinforced with corrugated metal to keep the dirt from collapsing back in. The whole point of them is to let you install a basement window below ground level while still allowing some natural light to filter down into the basement. Here's the thing that really scared me in that moment. There was absolutely zero chance that Marcus would have accidentally fallen into our window well. We had spent literally years playing hide and seek and running around, playing all sorts of outdoor games throughout the entire neighborhood together. We knew the location of every single window well, every house layout, and every forest trail, as well as we knew our own backyards. The grunt I'd heard sounded distinctly human, not like any animal I'd ever encountered. What made it even creepier was that whatever had made that sound also managed to pull itself out of the well fairly quietly, without all the thrashing and scrambling you would expect from someone who had just taken an unexpected fall. That was the exact moment when my brain finally caught up with what was happening, and I realized with absolute certainty that this wasn't just some playful game anymore. Someone or something was definitely out there in my yard, and it wasn't Marcus. I pressed my face against the window screen, desperately trying to see what was going on outside. But the screen that kept the bugs out also prevented me from leaning my head out far enough to see the area directly below me, right up against the house wall. Then my blood ran cold as I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the noisy gravel below. This detail stood out to me immediately, because Marcus would have known exactly where every single one of those log rounds was positioned. He would never ever have stepped in the gravel and made that crunching sound. He understood how strict my parents were just as well as I did, and he'd developed the same skills for moving silently that I had over our years of playing together. But whatever was down there had just carelessly stepped into the gravel, and then suddenly, the crunching stopped. I held my breath, like not daring to make even the slightest sound. I stayed frozen there with my face pressed hard against the screen, 2 stories up, straining to hear anything at all, for what must have been around 30 minutes. Though honestly, it felt like an entire hour had passed. Looking back as an adult, I doubt I actually had the patience to wait much longer than half an hour at that age. But in the moment, time seemed to stretch on forever. The scariest part was that I never heard whatever it was leave. Eventually, pure exhaustion won out over my fear, and I drifted off to sleep right there in my bed next to the open window. Even now, years later, there are several things I'm absolutely certain about when I think back on that night. First, and most importantly, it definitely wasn't Marcus out there. When I finally worked up the courage to ask him about it the next day, he looked at me with genuine confusion and told me he'd gone straight to bed the moment he got home that night. I knew him well enough to know he had no reason whatsoever to lie to me about something like that. Second, I'm completely confident it wasn't any of our neighbors either, and I still can't think of any legitimate reason why anyone would have been prowling around out there in the middle of the night. We barely had any neighbors to begin with, just a small handful of families spread across those 7 homes, and only 2 of those households even had kids. Remember, these 7 houses were scattered across properties of 2.5 acres or more each, so we weren't exactly living in a place where people just casually wandered through. And third, it couldn't have been some large animal because there simply weren't any in our area. Despite being surrounded by extensive forest on all sides, we only ever saw occasional deer, and even those were hunted enough that they typically stayed far away from people's homes. Plus, our dog would have definitely chased off any deer that got too close. Whoever or whatever you were out there in those dark woods that autumn night, I genuinely hope with every fiber of my being that our paths never cross again. This happened in October 2 years ago when I was working late shifts at this office building downtown. It was one of those older buildings from the 70s that's mostly empty now because half the companies moved out during the pandemic and never came back. And that time of year, it was already getting dark by 6, so when my shift ended at 11, it felt like the middle of the night. My shift ended around 11 p.m., and I'd park in the attached garage, which was this dim concrete structure that always felt too big for how few cars were actually in it. Maybe 10 or 15 vehicles scattered across 3 floors, meant to hold hundreds. I usually parked on the 2nd level near the Sky Bridge entrance because it felt safer being closer to the building. But that night, someone was already in my usual spot, so I ended up on the 3rd floor in this corner section where the overhead lights were out and had been out for weeks, despite me mentioning it to building management multiple times. My car was this older Honda that I've had since college, and the driver's side door didn't always lock right on the first try, so you had to pull the handle and check it, which meant I was standing there next to my car for an extra 30 seconds, making sure it was actually secure. While standing, I noticed there was another car about 5 spaces down from mine. It was a dark blue SUV with tinted windows, and I was pretty sure it hadn't been there when I parked that morning, but I couldn't remember for certain because I never really paid attention to what other cars were around. The thing that struck me as odd was that all its doors were open, not just cracked open, but standing wide open like someone had gotten out in a hurry and left them that way. And the interior light was on so I could see the inside was empty. I stood there looking at it for a minute, trying to decide if I should call security or just mind my own business, and I was leaning toward just leaving because it wasn't really my problem. Then all of a sudden I heard this strange sound coming from somewhere deeper in the garage, past where the lights were working, and it sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the concrete floor. The sound would scrape for a few seconds and then stop and then start again, and it was coming from the direction of the ramp that led down to the 2nd level. My first thought was maybe someone's car had broken down and they were trying to push it or move something. but it was almost midnight, and there was nobody else around that I could see, and something about the rhythm of the sound felt absolutely wrong, like it sounded too irregular to be someone deliberately pulling something. It was more like something being moved in short, desperate bursts. I got in my car and locked the doors and sat there with the engine off, trying to decide what to do. And that's when I saw someone walk past the SUV coming from the direction of that scraping sound. It was a man wearing dark clothes, and he was walking normally. He wasn't running or acting suspicious in any way. He was just walking with his hands in his pockets, heading toward the stairwell exit on the far side of the garage. He didn't look at me or the SUV or anything. He just kept walking at this steady pace. And something about how calm he seemed made my stomach turn, because the scraping sound had stopped right before he appeared, and now everything was quiet. He went through the stairwell door and it closed behind him, and I waited there in my car for another few minutes before I started the engine and drove toward the exit ramp as fast as I could without squealing my tires. I took the ramp down to the second level, and that's when I had to stop because there was something blocking part of the lane. And when my headlights hit it, I realized it was a rolling suitcase, the kind people take on airplanes. The suitcase was literally just sitting there on its side in the middle of the driving lane. The handle was extended like someone had been pulling it and then just let go. And there was a dark streak on the concrete leading from the suitcase back toward the wall where the parking spaces were, and the streak looked wet and reflected my headlights in a way that made me not want to look at it too closely. I sat there staring at this suitcase, trying to figure out what to do. And I knew I should call 911, but I also knew that if I sat there any longer, I was going to completely panic. So I drove around the suitcase, giving it as wide a berth as I could, and went straight down the exit ramp to the ground level and out onto the street. I drove 3 blocks before I pulled over and called the police, and I told them what I'd seen, from the open SUV down to the suitcase, and the man I had seen walking in the garage, and they said they would send someone to check it out, and took my information. I didn't hear anything back from them for 2 days, and when I finally called the non-emergency line to follow up, they told me officers had searched the garage that night and found the SUV, which had been reported stolen 3 days earlier from a mall parking lot across town. But they didn't find any suitcase or any evidence of anything else, and they seemed annoyed that I had called back about it, like I was literally wasting their time. I asked about the streak on the concrete, and they said the garage floor was wet from a cleaning crew that had been working that evening, and there was nothing unusual about it. The thing is, I know what I saw, and I know that suitcase was there blocking the lane, and I know the building doesn't have a cleaning crew that works at night because I've been there late enough times to know the janitorial staff comes in the early morning around 6. I also know that when I went back to work the next day and parked on the 3rd floor again, there was this smell in that corner section where I had parked. That smelled something chemical and sharp that reminded me of the biology lab in high school, and it stayed there for almost a week before it finally faded. I don't park on the 3rd floor anymore. I started parking on the street and paying the meter, even though it costs more. And I put in my notice at that job 2 months later for reasons that weren't entirely about the parking garage, but weren't entirely not about it either. I still wonder sometimes what was in that suitcase and why that man was walking so calmly toward the stairs, and whether the police actually looked as carefully as they said they did. But mostly, I just try not to think about it, because thinking about it means accepting that something bad probably happened 20 feet from where I was sitting in my car, and I just drove away. This happened back in October 2019, and honestly, I still get anxious every fall when the leaves start changing. I was 23 at the time of the incident, renting this little house way out on the edge of town in Pennsylvania. My house backyard opened right up to this massive cornfield that hadn't been cut down yet. The cornfield just had these tall brown stalks that were all dried out and dead, always making this constant scratching sound whenever the wind blew through them. My closest neighbor was about a quarter mile down the road, which I actually liked at first because I had always wanted my own space. Let's go a little bit into my schedule. I worked second shift at a factory, and I always got home around 11:30 most nights, and the quiet darkness never really bothered me until mid-October when things started getting weird. It started with my back porch light, like I would leave it on before heading to work, but strangely, 3 nights in a row, I came home to find the light turned off, and when I checked the bulb, it was unscrewed just enough that it wouldn't light up anymore. I figured it was probably just loose or maybe the wiring was going bad, so I didn't think too much about it at first. Then a few days later, I noticed these footprints in the dirt right outside my bedroom window, and I swear the footprints were clearly fresh and facing toward the glass. I tried telling myself it was probably just my landlord checking on something, even though he had never mentioned coming by. And even though he had come to check on the property, why would he wander around my window like that? I mean, I paid rent. Anyways, the thing that really got to me happened about a week after that. I came home from work one night and found my trash can pulled away from the side of the house, and it was literally tipped over. But it wasn't like an animal had gotten into it, or the wind had knocked it over, or something similar. Looking at how everything was, someone had actually gone through everything and sorted it all into neat piles on the ground. Like my junk mail in one pile, food containers in another, everything organized by type like they'd been carefully going through my stuff. What the f***? I immediately called the non-emergency police line because at that point, I was starting to feel pretty unsettled, and one officer came out to take a look around. He was polite about it, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. He said it was probably just bored teenagers messing around. The officer even told me to get better locks, and left after maybe 15 minutes. That weekend, I ended up staying at my sister's place in town because I just needed a break from feeling paranoid all the time. When I came back Sunday evening, the first thing I noticed was that one of my kitchen windows was unlocked, and I know for a fact I always kept them locked because I was already on the edge about everything. It wasn't open or anything, but was just unlatched, and I stood there in the kitchen trying to convince myself that maybe I had forgotten and opened it before I left. I walked through the entire house checking every room, and nothing looked stolen or even moved around until I got to my bedroom and I saw something sitting on my nightstand right on top of the book I had been reading. It was a corn husk that someone had twisted and tied into the shape of a little doll, and I knew with certainty that I hadn't put it there because I have never even gone near that cornfield. I didn't even think about it. I just grabbed my keys and drove straight back to my sister's apartment and called the police from there. This time they took me seriously and sent 2 officers to check out the house, and they ended up finding more boot prints in the soft mud behind the property that led from the cornfield right up to my back door, and then disappeared back into the stalks. They tried searching the field with flashlights, but it was too dense and dark to see much of anything, so they told me I should probably stay somewhere else for a few days while they increased patrols in the area. I never went back to that house alone after that. My dad and brother-in-law came with me to pack up all my stuff over the next week, and we only went during daylight hours and moved as quickly as we could. On our very last trip, when we were grabbing the final few boxes, my dad decided to walk out to the edge of the cornfield to look around one more time. He went maybe 30 feet into the stalks and found this spot where someone had deliberately pushed down and broken the corn to create a small clearing. And sitting right in the middle of it was a folding camping chair surrounded by empty water bottles and what must have been dozens of cigarette butts scattered all over the ground. The chair was positioned facing directly toward my house, like it was facing toward my bedroom window specifically, and it hit me all at once that someone had been sitting out there in the dark, watching me for God knows how long. My dad called the police right away, and they came back out to collect everything as evidence. They said they would check for fingerprints, but nothing ever came of it. No usable prints or any way to figure out who it was. My landlord insisted nothing like this had ever happened at the property before, and when the farmer finally harvested the corn, about a week later, the police didn't find anything else hidden out there. I moved into an apartment complex in town with security cameras and neighbors on all sides, and somewhere in a police storage room, there's still an evidence bag with that corn husk doll inside it. I think about it sometimes, about whoever was out there sitting in that camping chair in the middle of that bloody dark cornfield, watching my lit windows at night and smoking cigarettes and just waiting for something. I don't know what they wanted or what would have happened if I had stayed longer, and I don't know if they just moved on to watching someone else after I left.